Welcome. We're glad that you're here this morning. I want you to take your Bibles or your apps or whatever you read the Bible on and turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 1. Matthew, chapter 1. Now, if you don't have a Bible with you, there are Bibles in the chairs around you. Feel free to grab one of those. If you're not familiar with where Matthew is at, I would encourage you to go to the table of contents at the beginning of the book. I want you to turn there and look for a big heading called the New Testament. Matthew is the first book in the New Testament. So that's the book you're looking for. Matthew chapter 1. If you don't have a Bible at home, please, that Bible that you grabbed, please feel free to take that home today after service. We want everybody to have a Bible at their home that they can read and reference and study. So please, let that be our gift to you this Christmas season, to take that Bible with you. Now, as you're turning to Matthew chapter 1, let me tell you about a famous ancestor I have. This ancestor was written about in two of Mark Twain's books. Humphrey Bogart played him in a 1940 movie called Virginia City. And this is my ancestor. His name is John A. Merle. Handsome guy, right? Now, this is the only known picture of him. But let me tell you why he's famous. This man, John A. Merle, is famous because he was a well-known horse and slave thief of his day and time. Ooh, this is getting interesting. He was a steamboat pirate on the Mississippi River. He would literally board a steamboat, steal everything, and then sink it in the Mississippi. He was also a government conspirator. It is known that he actually plotted to take over the city of New Orleans so that he could become the governor and run it the way he wanted to run it. He was the leader of a gang, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,500 men, called the Mystic Clan. And he was the leader of this group. Man, I come from great lineage, don't I? Now listen to what Mark Twain says about him. In one of Mark Twain's books called The Life on the Mississippi, this is what Mark Twain wrote about him. He says, when he traveled, his usual disguise was that of an itinerant preacher. And it is said that his discourses were very soul-moving. Pretty good so far, right? Interesting, the hearers so much that they forgot to look after their horses, which were carried away by his Confederates while he was preaching. It didn't end so well. It started good, didn't end so well. But he was very well known. I didn't say this in the last service. I forgot to mention it. But one of his body parts is actually in the Tennessee State Museum. When he died, they robbed his grave, took a thumb, and it comes out for display once a year in the Tennessee State Museum. I am famous. I come from famous people. Not the kind of fame I'm looking for as a preacher. I mean, he was a guy that would go around preaching, and so people were so enthralled by what he was preaching. He was, Mark Twain's words, soul-moving were his sermons, that people would forget to watch over their horses, and his people would steal the horses and steal their homes while he was gone. Don't worry, your cars are fine. I don't have anybody out checking your vehicles. It's okay. But this kind of lineage is not something that a lot of people are proud of, right? It's not something that, you look up in your genealogy and you go, wow, I'm glad to be from that guy, And genealogies are interesting. I know that there's been this huge wave over the last about 20 years of people kind of rediscovering their ancestry. We have entire websites and companies that are devoted to discovering who your ancestors are and who you're related to. And in my discovery process, that's who I found. He's actually mentioned in Mark Twain's book, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. I think it's chapter 25. Tom and Huck go off to go search for treasure, and they have a run-in with a character named Injun Joe. And during that intercourse, Injun Joe goes to hide something and discovers treasure under the floorboards of a house. And the treasure's name is Merle's treasure. That's my guy. Merle's treasure, that was me. So that's my lineage. Isn't that interesting? Now, you look at that and you go, is Chad like that though? Is Pastor Chad stealing from all of us while we're listening to him give the sermon? Well, I've been here over a year and I haven't done that yet. But the fact of the matter is our genealogies are different and unique. And we're going to look at the genealogies of Jesus today. Now, you may go, oh my gosh, wait. You're going to preach on a list of names. Yep, I sure am. Are you ready? Here we go. So, let me tell you about the two passages that tell us about Jesus' genealogy. The first one that I want to bring to light is Luke chapter 3. Now, I'm not going to have you turn there. I'm going to focus on Matthew chapter 1 today. But in Luke chapter 3, Luke gives a lineage all the way from Jesus all the way to Adam. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't trace my lineage that accurately or that far back. You may be able to, but I can't trace it back to Adam. But they could back in this day and time. You see, Luke traces physical descent. In other words, he traces a genetic lineage from Jesus all the way down to Adam, the first man ever created by God. And he tracks this. Now, Matthew does it through a different person. If you go and read Luke, and you read Luke 3, and you read all the names, you're going to find that Luke traces Jesus back to David's son, Solomon. Now, Solomon was the king right after David. So Luke is tracing, or back up, that's Matthew. Luke traces from Jesus back to David's son named Nathan. Now, Nathan was this kind of unknown son of King David. He didn't do much. He's mentioned in passing in 2 Samuel chapter 5. There's not anything else really said about him. But there is a lineage from the line of Nathan, the son of David, that goes to Jesus. And the interesting thing is that back in Jesus' day, they literally had scrolls and scrolls and scrolls of all the names of all the people who were ever born of Jewish heritage. And so you could literally go to the temple and say, I want to look up my lineage. And they would be able to go through these scrolls and pull out a scroll that had your family name on it and pull it out and trace your lineage all the way back to Adam. That's how closely they kept record of that. Now, on a side note, why do we keep talking about King David? Well, in 2 Samuel 7, it is prophesied that the Messiah would come from the line of David. But here's the thing. Those scrolls that I mentioned in the temple were all destroyed in 70 A.D. when the temple was destroyed by the Roman government. It was burned to the ground. So there is no person that can come forward and claim to be the Messiah from the line of David and conclusively prove that they came from the line. That ability stopped in 70 A.D. So the Messiah had to have come before that time. Isn't that interesting? But Jesus, the Son of God, from the line of David, is born, most people believe, in 4 BC, and lives before all of those records are destroyed. Actually, right before all those records are destroyed. Just more proof that the Son of God that we worship truly is the Son of God, the Messiah, the Christ. So, Luke traces it back to Adam through the line of Nathan, David's son. Matthew goes a different direction, though. So I want you to take your Bibles, turn to Matthew 1. We're going to start in verse 1. Don't worry, I'm not going to read all these names because first off, I would butcher them. And second of all, yes, I'll admit it's kind of boring to read through this many names. I get that. But I want you to look with me at verse 1 real quick. Look at what it says. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Matthew doesn't trace Jesus' lineage through Nathan. He traces Jesus' lineage through Solomon the king. So it wasn't unusual in this day and time, and I think if you kind of searched your own ancestry, it wouldn't be unusual for you either, to be able to go dozens of generations back and be able to find out that you have crisscrossing lineages. So it's not unusual for David or for Jesus to be able to trace his lineage through 2 different sons of King David. That was very natural. Nathan's lineage went this way, Solomon's went this way, and at one point they intersected. That was totally normal. It happens all the time. And so Jesus can be the son of David through Nathan and Solomon. It's totally possible for that to happen. So, but Matthew makes his intentions known from the very start in verse 1. What is he seeking to prove? That Jesus is a descendant of David and of Abraham. That is Matthew's point. Now remember, a few weeks ago, if you were here, Matthew was written, the audience is Jewish people. Luke was writing to the Greeks. Matthew is writing to the Jewish people. And so for Jewish people to understand that Jesus was of the line of David was of the utmost importance. Matthew had to prove this. So Matthew does that, but he traces the lineage not through just genetic lineage, he traces it through the royal line of succession. He goes through all the kings. He traces the line of kings all the way to Jesus. But there's an interesting thing about this. He uses a different lineage, and he actually omits parts in his tracing of sons and fathers. He actually uses the same genealogy that we find in 1 Corinthians 3. And so I'm not going to turn there or read that. You can go and look at that later. It's 1 Corinthians 3 gives a similar laying out of that. But he also lays this out in rotations of 14. So one more nerd out of me, and then I'll stop and get to the point of the message. Look with me in verse 17. Matthew 1:17. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. Matthew is tying in these numbers. And the reason I'm making mention of this is numbers are vitally important to the Jewish people. There is not a single number in the Bible that doesn't have some kind of vital importance to the Jewish people. 14 was a holy number. And so Matthew, and I could spend a whole sermon on this, but I'm not because you'd be bored to death. But 14 is a pointing to Jesus being a holy and complete person, to being a fulfillment of something. And so I just want to point out that Matthew is very intentional about the way he structures the genealogy that he records so that he can give a message to the Jewish people. We as Gentiles, non-Jews, will never fully understand the deep levels of meaning that Matthew has put into these first 17 verses of the book of Matthew. So, that being said, now let's get to the meat of this. Let's get to what I really want to get to. Look with me in verse 3. So chapter 1, verse 3, it says this. And Judah, now Judah was one of Jacob's sons. He was, if you remember the story of Joseph, Genesis 38 through 50. If you remember the story of Joseph, Judah is one of Joseph's brothers. Now look at what it says. Verse 3, and Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Now isn't that interesting? Let me point out something. It mentions a woman here. Now why is that interesting? Why is that important? Jewish people never tracked lineage through the female, through the mother. No, women could not inherit property. Daughters could not continue the family name and legacy. It always happened through sons. So why is Matthew mentioning Tamar here? I'll get back to that. Now look with me in verse 5. Verse 5. And Salmon, I hope I said that right, the father of Boaz by Rahab, another woman. And look, keep going. And Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth. Isn't that interesting? There's two more women mentioned in Jesus' lineage right here. Now keep going. Look with me in verse 6. And Jesse, the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Now, why in the world is Matthew mentioning all of these women? When women weren't used to track genealogies and lineages and inheritance, why is Matthew, if his audience is Jewish, why is he making mention of all these women? Well, I think we need to look at who these women are. So who's the woman in verse 3? Tamar. So if you go back to Genesis chapter 38, you're going to read an account about this woman named Tamar. And she is to be married to one of Judah's sons. So she's going to become Judah's daughter-in-law. Well, the son dies before they can get married. And so Judah promises to marry her to one of his other sons. It was a Jewish tradition that they do this. And so he had promised that, and he kept delaying it and kept delaying it and kept delaying it. And time drug on and on and on. And Tamar finally decided she had had enough of waiting. And if you go back into Genesis 38, you're going to read this account of Tamar disguising herself as a city prostitute. And she goes in and basically sleeps with Judah, who was going to be her father-in-law. She sleeps with him, and she gets pregnant with twins. And from one of those twins comes the line of Jesus. Jesus came, one of the lineages of Jesus came from an immoral situation. Let's keep reading. Verse 5. And Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab. Now, who was Rahab? Well, if you go into Joshua chapter 2, Joshua is led into by the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And it's this story of Moses leading the people out of Egypt, and they roam the desert for 40 years, and then they're finally given permission to go in, and Joshua is the one that leads them into the promised land, Joshua chapter 1. And one of the first cities that comes into their sights is the city of Jericho. And they send 2 spies into the city of Jericho to kind of check things out, see how the fortifications are, but they get discovered by the king of Jericho. And so they're running for their lives, they're trying to hide, and this prostitute named Rahab says, come into my house. Well, she just happens to live on a house that's built on the wall of the city. And she says, come, I'll hide you. And so she hides them, she sends the soldiers searching for them, she sends them on a wild goose chase, and they escape. And as they escape, they tell her, we will remember you and your family when God delivers Jericho into the hands of the Israelites. And so when Jericho falls, Rahab and her family are spared, and she ends up becoming part of the lineage of Jesus. But she was a foreign prostitute before that. Then, the very next section of verse 5, and Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth. Now, how in the world could Ruth be controversial? If you've read the book of Ruth, it's this beautiful story of this mom and dad and their 2 sons. They leave Israel because there's this big famine and they're going to die if they stay there. And they go to this land called Moab. And they settle in Moab, and this lady's 2 sons get married, and they get married to these ladies of Moab. And then what ends up happening is all 3 men, the woman's husband and the 2 sons, all 3 of these men pass away, leaving all 3 women as widows. And so the mother decides she's going to go back to Israel, and one of the daughter-in-laws, a Moabite, decides she's going to go with her, Ruth. And long story short, Ruth, through a number of circumstances that take place, ends up getting married to an Israelite man named Boaz, and Boaz ends up becoming, their child ends up becoming an ancestor of Jesus. But why is Ruth controversial? Because she was a Moabite. Listen to what Deuteronomy 23:3 says. It says, no Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever. Isn't that interesting? Because not only is King David of Moabite ancestry, but so is Jesus himself. Yet Deuteronomy 23 tells us that a Moabite could not step foot in the temple, in the assembly. That David and Jesus, arguably 2 of the greatest men in this book, come from Moabites. And yet, if you were here a few weeks ago, I made an argument that Jesus didn't just enter the temple, Jesus was the temple. That Jesus' death, life, his resurrection, his ascension into heaven was all pointing us to having a temple experience through his Holy Spirit living inside of us. That's why 1 Corinthians 6 tells us that we are the temple of the Lord. But I want you to notice something with all these women. And if we keep reading, you're going to read that Bathsheba's in that mix in verse 6. Bathsheba, go read 2 Samuel 11. 2 Samuel 11 is all about David. He sees this woman. He takes her into his room. Even though she's married to another man, she gets pregnant. He tries to cover it up. And in order to cover it up, he ends up having to kill her husband, have her husband killed. Jesus' lineage is full of outcasts. Jesus' lineage is full of those that weren't deemed worthy in Jesus' day and time. They were unworthy of God by society. That's what society said about them. But that was King David and King Jesus' lineage. Let me say this statement. I want you to hear this clearly. Jesus came through and for the outcast. Jesus came through outcasts for outcasts. And here's the fact. Every single person ever born, every single one of us sitting in this room, every single person is an outcast because we, according to Romans, have all fallen short of the glory of God because of our sins, because of the way we have disobeyed God. We are the outcasts. And Jesus died for every single one of us. He came from outcasts for the outcasts. You see, Jesus was and is the Son of God. He came to this earth. He lived a perfect, sinless life because we couldn't. We can't live without sin. Most of us in this room have sinned today. And Jesus came, lived a perfect life because we couldn't. And in that perfection, in that sinlessness, he died an innocent life as the perfect, sinless sacrifice. And it's because of his death that we can be saved from our disobedience to God. It's only through his death that we can be saved from the consequences of our sin, that eternal death that awaits us if we don't know him. But because of Jesus, we are now favored in God's eyes. We are made right. We are made innocent in the eyes of God because the punishment was already put on Jesus. But he couldn't have done that if he didn't live a sinless life. And also, I don't think he could have done that if he didn't have those moral outcasts in his lineage. There's a reason God brought his lineage through people like Tamar and Ruth and Rahab and Bathsheba. There's a reason God used those women, the women that were outcast for scandals or moral decisions. Hear me on this. Your past does not define you. Your past, whether it be some family member down the line, does not define you. John A. Merle does not define Chad Merle. He has no impact on my salvation through Jesus Christ. But here's the cool thing. Not just family lineage, but I am saved from everything I've ever done too. My past decisions do not define me. The mistakes I've made, the sins I've committed, the evils that I've done, the mistakes that I've hurt people with, those don't define me. My relationship with Jesus defines me. That's where my identity is found. And so I want you to hear this today. The love of Jesus defines you. You may be brought down by guilt. You may be dealing with shame, but you don't have to carry that any longer. Jesus will take your guilt. He took that guilt when he died on the cross. He takes your shame, and he makes you holy and innocent. He makes you what you could never be on your own. We can never be good enough. We can never do enough good things. We can never donate enough money. We can never be nice enough to people to make our way into heaven because we have broken God's perfect plan for our lives. But when we have a relationship with Jesus, all of that past, all of that sin, all those mistakes, they go away. It's only through Jesus that your shame and your guilt and your sin can be taken. And let me say this, if you are sitting there and you feel like an outcast, please hear me. You have a family in Jesus. You don't have to be an outcast. You can be part of a family. Is it a perfect family? No, because it's made up of people. But it's a family that's based on the infinite, unending love of Jesus in your life. What is Jesus calling you to do in light of that love? Follower of Jesus, how has your life been changed? How is it being changed right now? If you don't know Jesus, maybe Jesus is calling you into his love today. If you have questions, if you're curious about what a life-changing relationship with Jesus looks like, my name is Pastor Chad. I would love the opportunity to answer your questions and talk to you about that and kind of unpack what that looks like. So if you've got questions, come grab me after service. I would love to talk to you about that. But where are you in light of the love of Jesus? You don't have to be an outcast. You can be part of Jesus' family. Join me in prayer.